This past Monday, it was my honor and privilege to preach the funeral mass for Father Tom Boland. Father Tom was the first pastor that I was assigned to as a seminarian, and then 4 years later, as I wrote in the bulletin column that you have this weekend, I was sent back there again as my first assignment as a priest, serving there for 2 years and a couple of months. And over that period of time, Tom became both a pastor and a mentor to me. And then as time went on, he became something even more precious. He became a friend. Our close friendship goes together over 25 years and especially includes Holy Thursday meal every time until the pandemic came. And so it was at his funeral when I'm going to preach a funeral, I've got a lot of material to work with, and I knew that it was going to be, lengthy because they're never short, right? And so I had a lot of material, but I had to let some of it out. And even then it was still quite a bit of material. But one story I left out really bothered me that I left it out, till I realized as I looked at what I was preaching this weekend that this would work as the intro, the first move in tonight's reflection. So let me do it this way. Sometime in those first 2 years of my priesthood, when I was an associate pastor, it was on the feast of the Epiphany of the Lord. I had preached, and in the middle of the homily, a mom, a dad, and 2 kids rather demonstrably left the building. If you remember the Holy Spirit, it's a big building, there's a long aisle, and that's before the side doors were there that are there now, so everyone in the world watched them leave. You never know what the reason for their leaving is. Perhaps a 911 call, perhaps an emergency, maybe they thought they were in the wrong building. Who knows what it was, but they left right in the middle of the homily. It was a provocative homily. What I remember about the homily is that I took the magi, the 3 wise men, and I say women, men and women, I made them prophet figures and said that the magi represent prophets in our midst, which means that they have some wisdom that is to be shared with us, and we have some wisdom that is to be shared with them. I used 3 controversial examples to make my point. The first example was illegal immigrants. This was 20 years ago. And then the second example, gays and lesbians. And the third example, Catholics who are divorced and remarried outside the church. Very prominent controversial issues. My point being that what the Magi taught us is something about the differences in life. They'd come from a foreign country. They had foreign influences, and they also benefited from their commerce with us, with the people that they came to visit. In other words, everyone's life has changed, the Magi and the people were emboldened by their wisdom and the sharing of wisdom. Well, I thought it was a fairly good message, even though I know those examples were controversial. I got back to the rectory, and Tom came to visit me in my suite, and he said, "Well, Gary, you've run off your first family from the parish." Well, I was immediately horrified. That sort of thing to this day horrifies me, that someone would be so upset that they would leave a church over something that I said. I was stammering, I was embarrassed, I was upset, almost to tears. The whole thing was just, I thought I was going to be disciplined for something, and then all of a sudden Tom, with a little smile, looked at me and he goes, "I've been waiting for them to leave for several years." But the lesson taught me something. It taught me that there is some importance in taking controversial questions and laying them before us, not to figure them out, but to actually explore what we as Christians are to do in the midst of very difficult and vexing issues. Tonight's readings help focus our attention. The first reading, which I clued you in on at the intro to the liturgy, is from the book of Numbers, one of the first 5 books of the Bible. To give you some situation to place the book in its proper place in history, the Israelites have already been freed from slavery. That was the book of Exodus, and they're now wandering around in the desert. They've received the law. That was the book of Deuteronomy. Now the book of Numbers speaks of their 40 years they're going to wander in the desert. Now, what you need to know is that the episode this evening takes place in the second of their 40 years. They've got a long way to go. And what's happening is, as a result of now, the thrill of being released from slavery has evaporated. And what happens then when people are in a position where they're uncomfortable, they all begin to complain. They complained that there was no water. Then ultimately Moses had to strike the rock to bring water for them to drink. Then they complained that they missed all the food that they had in Egypt. So the Lord sent them manna. Then they complained that the manna always taste the same. I don't think there are flavors of manna. Wow, this was surprising. But nevertheless, very upset about that. And then they got upset because they wanted meat, so God sent them quail. So much that, of course, they got sick of quail and said they didn't want it anymore. I guess they could have had a can of SpaghettiOs. That would have done something for them. But there they are in this perpetual state of being unhappy. They're out in the wilderness. There doesn't seem to be the end in sight. It just seems to be miserable. Moses realizes that these people are so mad that they could do him harm. So he goes up to the mountain alone to speak to God, and he says, you have to deliver me from these people or they'll stone me to death, he says. And the Lord says, go appoint 72 elders to assist you. That's where tonight's story comes from. I know you heard the word 70, but there were really 72. It makes sense. There are 12 tribes of Israel, 6 in each tribe. Perfect. 6 times 12, 72. And when you add Eldad and Medad, you get 71 and 72 anyway. 70 of them do as they're told. They go out to the meeting tent, participate in whatever ritual they were doing, and the Spirit descends upon them and they begin prophesying. When they go back into the camp, people notice that Medad and Eldad are prophesying, and everyone seems to know they were not there at the meeting tent. They had not received their commission. The informer then goes up to Moses and says, Eldad and Medad are prophesying, make them stop. Moses' answer is so wonderful. He says, would that every person here be a prophet. The story then is mimicked in our gospel reading. The apostles have been emboldened now. They're beginning to work things in their ministry. They can see the power of God working through them and casting out demons and in curing the sick and moving around. Suddenly, outsiders have become on the inside of a very exciting operation. And then they discover one amongst their midst who's doing the same thing they're doing, but is not one of them. The informer, this time John, goes to Jesus and says, there are people prophesying in your name who are not one of us. Tell them to stop. And Jesus makes it rather clear that anyone who's not against us is for us. And therefore, he does not silence the prophet, nor did Moses silence the prophet. The two stories kind of link together about how God chooses prophets, apparently in ways that we don't always understand or appreciate, and what God expects these prophets to do. As a transition, I wanted to add this element about prophecy. Prophets are human beings. They're not gods. They're not divine. They are human, just like the rest of us, which means prophets sin. Prophets don't always get everything right. We have to understand that about prophets. And as a result of that, even the prophet, inspired by God, benefits from the people of God with whom the prophet speaks, and vice versa. That is the whole idea of the exchange between the prophet that's received some inspiration from God that might be different, that might be out in the left field or right field, and the people who have to assimilate that and make that a way that it's going to work. And in our modern times, that seems almost impossible, doesn't it? We live in what may be the most bitterly partisan times in American history. Now, of course, only speaking about the American experience, I'm utterly clueless about the other continents of the world, but just our country. We've experienced what's become the deepening kind of partisanship. Everyone finding themselves in one camp or the other, or you're being asked if you're in one camp or the other. Many of us want to stay in the middle and not be in any camp, and we find that there's literally no way to do that. Everything that you do that leans in one direction gets a hostile response from the other side. The camps are red and blue, Republican, Democrat, liberal, and conservative, among many other different ways. And now the current partisan battle du jour, vaccinated and unvaccinated. There are many other examples of all of that. But what happens in that partisanship, and this is with both groups, so don't hear this as one group being singled out. It's both sides of the partisan divide. Listen to their own sources of information. Look for something that coheres with something they already believe so they can feel justified, and reject any word that comes from the other side as being absolutely evil. It happens on both sides. And this point of view compromise is a dirty word. The idea that anyone would back down even an inch is unthinkable. And you see compromise, which is clearly the Christian way, is suddenly challenged by our heavily partisan times. Well, I've decided to use some more examples that are controversial to illustrate my point. The first example would be women who have had abortions. In our culture, particularly in our church, this is a major issue of conflict. And currently in the nation, the conflict is spilling out in all kinds of different kinds of ways. Women who have abortions are the ones that have to make a choice to do that and then have to live with that choice. There are also those who wish that they not make that choice. And so that's the conflict that happens. What's the church to do in these moments? You see, when the sides are bitter and partisan, what happens is the side that's opposed to abortion starts screaming things like murderer at somebody, as if that's somehow going to get them to change their mind. And then on the other side of the issue, the person becomes so caught up in the personhood of the woman who's bearing the child, and this is a significant thing, by the way, that the woman is bearing the child is not an insignificant fact. But also what gets lost in that conversation is there's another human being, their child. There is no easy solution, and everyone wants an easy solution. Victory at all costs, vanquishing of the other side. The church asks us to do something that we feel uncomfortable with doing. It asks us to accompany not just the women who have abortions, but the people who are upset about them having them. You see, they're all part of our big tent that we sang about in Gather Us In. The idea isn't that if you do one thing or another thing, you're against us, therefore you can't be a part of us. The idea is there's such a diversity of viewpoints and understandings in our community that what we do is we accompany, we walk with, we journey with people who may agree with us and people who disagree with us. That's the idea. We don't abandon, we don't divide up into camps. We journey looking for wisdom. You see, sometimes these characters become prophets. The women, for example, and I think also the children that have lost their lives are prophets to us. They remind us of the stakes of this particular issue and how important it is. And what we're being asked is not to fix it because we don't know how to fix it. We're being asked to not walk out the door. We're being asked not to shut the TV off. We're being asked not to make it go away. We're asked to do the messy work of accompanying everyone who's bitterly divided on this issue, because that's what Jesus does. The second example is very recent in our time, our understanding of it, our awareness of it, I should say it that way. These are adolescent boys and girls who become confused about their gender. All kinds of phrases are out there: gender fluidity, gender change, no gender, whatever. I'll tell you right at the outset, I know next to nothing about it. It's not something I've read about. I don't really have a working knowledge of. I'm simply aware of watching the controversy unfold in front of me. It's understandable, again, that there are different positions. You know, someone says you have to be the gender you were when you're born and no other gender. There's no way to reconcile that with the person who says the gender I was born with is not my gender. You can see the partisan and the divide. And there is not an easy solution. One side wants to win unequivocally, or the other side wants to win unequivocally, and such an outcome is so extremely unlikely. Just like I said, the first example, our mission is accompaniment. Accompaniment is not enabling. Accompaniment is not agreeing with a point of view. Accompaniment is not surrendering our moral values or anything. It's simply not slamming the door in front of somebody we dislike, whether it's Westboro Baptist Church or whether it is a person who's confused about their gender identity. And I'm going to add a special fact to this. These are adolescents. If you know anything about adolescent children, is that they become particularly damaged by judgments that are made against them. Many of them, if you listen to their stories, feel invisible, feel not recognized. They feel like a foreign person in their own body, and someone's telling them that that's all a figment of their imagination or a phase they're going through, and that's someone who's woefully ignorant about whatever that child is trying to say to someone else. It's one of the most damaging things you can do to an adolescent, to actually increase their stress. You know what? Jesus wants us to reduce their stress, not increase it. And not only that, but then there becomes the whole question of, with adolescents, the fact that they don't fit into their peer group. Adults don't seem to bother about that very much, but at the adolescent age, it means everything. And these children are vulnerable because they're the highest targets for violence and bullying, which all destroys the self-esteem and creates our problems. And worst of all, they have the highest rate of youth suicide. The issue cannot be ignored. It can't be swept under the rug. It can't be won by one side or the other. The issue is accompaniment. The doors are wide enough. The church is big enough for everyone to come here. Each of us struggles with our own sin, whatever that is. And we have to spend our focus on our sin, not theirs. And when we become a place where people can come without judgment, we become the place we sang about in that opening hymn this evening. The last thought is about our children in our school. Most of our children come from disadvantaged backgrounds, many of them from the West End. Almost 70% of them are eligible for some kind of financial aid. Many of them, we learned, don't have adequate food to eat, so we've given them a free breakfast every morning, and now we're partnering with Dare to Care to send nourishing meals to their families twice a month, part of the work that we're doing. And our school ministry is very challenging. It's expensive, money is scarce, and the people that we're educating don't have money to give us. They have something more precious to give us. They give us the opportunity to accompany people we will ordinarily never see. One look in the school, if you ever come on a weekday, will show you 40% of our population is African American, another 40% is white, and 20% is kind of a mixed group in between. And with that large number of people, the most diverse school in the Archdiocese, if you see the kids, it doesn't look like there's bigotry. They all play together. They socialize together. They do sleepovers at their houses. That would be unimaginable just a few years ago when you think about it. And what it teaches me, and I hope it shows you, is that this is a vital ministry of our church. Now, the vast majority of the students are not Catholic, and this is controversial. Why do we have a Catholic school to bring non-Catholics in? Good question. In the old days, the whole purpose of a Catholic school was to teach Catholics their religion. The modern purpose is different. Now, the ministry we have allows us to accompany people who are different than we are, who live differently than we do, that live in unfortunate circumstances and need some assistance. You see, we accompany them. Too much of these experiences for particularly the poor is separation, ostracization, judgment, all sorts of things, and no one who's willing to accompany them. You see, that's the hard work of ministry, walking with and journeying. And you see, each of these instances then can be people who are prophets, opportunities to speak where God's justice may reside in a different way, in a different place. And at the very same time, we, because of the beauty of our sacraments, the beauty of our worship, and the collective wisdom we've assimilated over the centuries, we have something to offer to them. See, it's not a matter of either or, it's a matter of both and. And that's always the challenge of discipleship. It's easy to be partisan. The problem with it is it's utterly, totally un-Christian. It is much more difficult to be assimilators because we still have to hold on to the things that we believe. We're not asked to sacrifice them. We just simply have to make room for a larger group of people and take off our agenda the need to change their life, because we can only work on our own transformation. And in doing that, by consorting with these prophets, by hearing about their wisdom, we learn a little bit about the world that we do not know, and they learn about our world which they do not know. My brothers and sisters, this is how churches grow. That's the whole mission of this church. That's why we proudly say in our bulletin to every person that walks through these doors, you belong here. This is one place where there is no room for division. This is one place where there's no room for partisanship. This is one place where there's an abundant room for accompaniment in the name of Jesus Christ. Still, it's challenging, isn't it? So my parting thought is this. If you're challenged by the idea of recognizing prophets, down through the ages, everyone else had the same challenge. They don't wear a name badge. They don't have something on their sweatshirt. They don't self-announce that they're a prophet. It's not easy to find out who is and who isn't. We can reach the point of saying they must not exist at all. But Eldad and Medad teach us differently. They're here. They're all around. You might say prophets are in our midst.